Hey guys, what made the 1990s version of beauty feel so strange was not simply that fashion became thinner, paler, or more severe. It was that an industry built to sell elegance found a way to make exhaustion look refined, fragility look intelligent, and visible decline look like style. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me what history topic you'd like me to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past, feel free to subscribe. To understand how starving came to look glamorous in parts of 1990s fashion, it helps to begin with a misunderstanding. Many people look back on that era and imagine a single sudden moment, as though the culture simply woke up one day and decided that looking hollow-eyed and underfed was beautiful. But the reality was slower, stranger, and in some ways more revealing. The look that would later be called heroin chic did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from older habits in fashion, from the economics of image-making, from the visual language of rebellion, and from an industry that had long rewarded bodies that could disappear into clothing while still attracting attention. That contradiction matters. Fashion has often wanted the body to be both present and absent at the same time. Present enough to provoke desire, aspiration, and imitation. Absent enough to let the garment, the photograph, the fantasy, and the brand remain in control. By the 1990s, that tension had become especially sharp. The glamorous excess associated with the previous decade had begun to look heavy, artificial, and overproduced. The high-gloss ideal of the late 1980s, with its polished skin, sculpted hair, obvious luxury, and exaggerated confidence, started to feel tied to a world that no longer seemed as convincing as it once had. This is one of the deeper reasons the aesthetic shift was so powerful. It was not only about thinness, though thinness was central. It was also about mood. The 1990s, especially in their early and middle years, developed a taste for images that looked stripped down, cool, ironic, detached, and a little damaged. In music, in advertising, in film, and in youth culture more broadly, there was prestige in appearing untouched by obvious effort. To look too polished was to risk looking shallow. To look too cheerful was to risk looking naive. A face that seemed tired, indifferent, or emotionally remote could be interpreted not as a warning sign, but as proof of authenticity. That alone tells us something important about the world that produced the look. Modern viewers often assume beauty standards are mainly about health or pleasure, but they are often just as deeply shaped by status signals and cultural emotion. What people call beautiful in one decade may be what another decade calls unsettling. The body becomes a screen onto which a society projects its anxieties, ideals, and private fantasies. In the 1990s, at least within influential parts of fashion and media, restraint mattered more than abundance. Coolness mattered more than warmth. Looking as though life had worn you down could be reframed as sophistication. And so the visual field changed. The glossy supermodel image did not vanish overnight, but it was increasingly challenged by something harsher and less reassuring. Instead of obvious vitality, there was a preference in some circles for vacancy, angularity, limp hair, bruised-looking shadows beneath the eyes, washed-out skin, narrow shoulders, jutting bones, and a general impression of having slept badly and eaten less. The photographs often seemed to reject the old promise that beauty was bright, healthy, and triumphant. In its place came a promise that beauty might be more interesting when it looked damaged. That word, interesting, is one of the quiet engines of fashion history. Industries built around novelty are always hunting for a new emotional charge. Once one image becomes too familiar, it risks becoming ordinary, and ordinariness is dangerous in a business that depends on attention. The severe thinness and visual bleakness of the era were not only sold as beautiful. They were sold as new, or at least as more culturally intelligent than what had come before. Even discomfort could be rebranded as sophistication if the image suggested irony, exclusivity, and artistic seriousness. This is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Because once a look begins to signal intelligence or insider status, criticism becomes harder. People hesitate. What might once have been called gaunt can now be described as editorial. What might once have looked like physical decline can be praised as edge. Language starts doing protective work for the image. The body is no longer merely thin. It is spare, minimal, raw, stripped back. A person does not look ill. She looks modern. And once those translations settle into the culture, the line between depiction and endorsement becomes much harder to see. The phrase heroin chic itself is revealing. It attached the glamour of fashion to imagery associated with addiction, decay, and emotional vacancy. Even at the time, many people recognized the ugliness of that equation. But the phrase endured because it named something real about the mood of the photographs. These were often images that borrowed from urban grit, underground culture, late-night fatigue, and the visual codes of collapse. They suggested a body that had been through something, though usually in a carefully curated and commercially useful way. The pain was aestheticized, not lived in full public reality. The danger was converted into atmosphere. And that conversion is one of the most important things to understand. Fashion has often borrowed from suffering without sharing its true cost. It takes signs associated with hardship, strips them from context, and turns them into visual style. In this case, the look flirted with the imagery of addiction and self-erasure while remaining safely inside magazine pages, runways, branded campaigns, and elite creative circles. It was danger made marketable, decay made photogenic. The body became a vehicle for suggesting transgression while still being useful to commerce. The effect on viewers was not always direct or simple. Not everyone saw the same images and decided to look like them. Culture does not move in such neat lines. But repeated images matter, especially when they appear in places that claim authority. Fashion magazines, ad campaigns, celebrity coverage, and popular cultural conversation all help define what counts as desirable, normal, or aspirational. When the most admired bodies in the visual environment are repeatedly narrow to the point of alarm, and when fatigue is styled as elegance, audiences begin to absorb a lesson even if nobody states it aloud. The lesson is not merely that thinness is good. It is that visible self-denial can have social value. For young viewers especially, that could be deeply confusing. The culture often sends mixed messages in every era, but the 1990s were particularly skilled at disguising harsh expectations as freedom. The decade often celebrated individuality, irony, rebellion, and anti-establishment cool. Yet underneath that language, many women and girls still encountered a punishingly narrow physical ideal. They were told, implicitly, that they should reject artificial perfection while still being impossibly controlled. They should appear natural, effortless, almost careless, but also remain legible as desirable. They should seem above conventional glamour while conforming to a powerful new version of it. That tension was exhausting because it made the standard harder to name. If the ideal had simply been presented as rigid and authoritarian, it might have been easier to resist. But when the ideal arrives disguised as authenticity, disaffection, or artistic honesty, it can feel more persuasive. Seems less like obedience and more like taste. That is part of what made the era so influential. It did not only sell a body, it sold a posture toward the world. There were practical reasons, too, and they should not be ignored. Fashion photography in the 1990s was deeply shaped by changing commercial environments, changing editorial strategies, and a constant appetite for visual differentiation. Designers wanted clothes to hang in a certain way. Photographers wanted silhouettes that produced stark, memorable lines. Editors wanted imagery that felt less conventional than the polished fantasy worlds of previous years. A thinner body was often treated as a more flexible canvas, something that could carry garments with fewer distractions, sharper angles, and stronger visual tension. What was framed as aesthetic refinement was also tied to professional convenience and industrial habit. That does not excuse it, but it helps explain why the ideal was so persistent. Harmful standards often survive because they are useful to powerful systems. Once agencies, brands, publications, and creative directors become accustomed to one type of body producing the images they want, the standard begins to feel self-justifying. The resulting photographs are then treated as proof that the standard works. The cycle tightens. The same look appears again and again, and its repetition begins to disguise its extremity. There is also the question of class because fashion rarely escapes it. The body ideal of the heroin chic era communicated not only thinness, but a certain kind of distance from ordinary life. The figure in those images often looked too detached for domestic routine, too aloof for visible hunger, too rarefied for practical labor. Even in campaigns meant to appear gritty or urban, there was usually an underlying privilege shaping the image. To look wasted in a magazine was not the same as living with instability, addiction, or deprivation. The industry borrowed the signs of hardship while keeping the protections of money, status, and curation. This gave the aesthetic a particularly cold quality. It was intimate in visual detail but emotionally remote. You could see cheekbones, shadows, skin texture, tired eyes. But the person in the image often seemed unavailable, sealed off, difficult to reach. That emotional distance was part of the appeal. In an age increasingly fluent in branding, unreadability could be sold as depth. A blank stare could look profound. A weak-looking body could look disciplined. Silence itself could be made luxurious. And yet, for all its apparent rebellion, the look was not truly outside the system. It was deeply inside it. That is another useful reversal. At first glance, the aesthetic seemed to reject mainstream prettiness. But once it spread through magazines, campaigns, and cultural conversation, it became its own mainstream language. What looked transgressive could quickly become formula. Hollow cheeks, vacant expressions, narrow hips, and visible exhaustion were repeated so often that the shock dulled. The industry that prides itself on originality had, in effect, mass-produced a version of depletion. The deeper tragedy is that repeated exposure can alter moral perception. When an unhealthy body is photographed beautifully often enough, viewers can begin to see the harm as elegance rather than harm. Not because they are foolish, but because beauty and danger are being deliberately woven together. The photograph teaches the eye what to admire. Over time, admiration can outrun judgment. There were critics, of course, and some objections were sharp. Parents, health advocates, cultural commentators, and some insiders argued that the look glamorized illness, self-neglect, and drug-associated imagery. Public discomfort grew stronger as discussions of eating disorders, body image, and media influence became more visible. But criticism often faced a familiar defense, that fashion was merely art, merely provocation, merely reflecting culture rather than shaping it. This defense allowed the industry to enjoy the power of influence while denying responsibility for its consequences. That denial is worth lingering over because it appears again and again in cultural history. Powerful image-making industries often want two incompatible things. They want to be taken seriously enough to define taste, but not seriously enough to be blamed for what that taste normalizes. They want their campaigns to shape aspiration, conversation, and desire, but when challenged, they retreat into ambiguity. It is only a picture. It is only style. It is only mood. But pictures accumulate. Style accumulates. Mood accumulates. And when millions of people are taught to see self-erasure as refinement, the result is never only aesthetic. By the middle of the decade, the broader culture had begun to absorb the mood in ways that extended beyond runways and editorials. Celebrity imagery, youth advertising, beauty discourse, and everyday fashion imitation all helped carry the look outward. Not everyone adopted the extreme version, but the underlying values spread more widely than the most explicit images did. Thinness remained central. Weariness could read as chic. Looking undone, if done correctly, became desirable. And once those ideas entered mainstream circulation, they could shape ordinary self-perception in quiet and persistent ways. What made the era especially potent was that it sat at the intersection of aspiration and anti-aspiration. Older glamour had asked viewers to want obvious luxury. This newer aesthetic asked viewers to want removal, reduction, and detachment. It was still aspirational, but it denied being so. That made it feel more modern, more private, and perhaps more dangerous. A body polished for admiration is visible in its ambition. A body styled as if it does not care can hide the machinery of discipline much more effectively. And so, beneath the cool surfaces of the photographs, a harder question was beginning to press itself forward. If this new ideal claimed to reject artifice, why did it require such a carefully managed performance of weakness? If it claimed to be honest, why did it turn visible depletion into a luxury image? And if it was really about rebellion, why did so many people feel pressured to imitate it? Those questions would only grow sharper as the decade continued, and as the public face of fashion became more entangled with celebrity culture, media anxiety, and a mounting argument over whether the industry had crossed from representation into active glamorization. Because once a body ideal begins to influence not only how models are photographed, but how ordinary people judge themselves in mirrors, the story is no longer just about style. It becomes a story about power, desire, discipline, and the cost of making disappearance look beautiful. Because once a body ideal begins to influence not only how models are photographed, but how ordinary people judge themselves in mirrors, the story is no longer just about style. It becomes a story about power, desire, discipline, and the cost of making disappearance look beautiful. And nowhere was that transformation more visible than in the relationship between fashion magazines and ordinary private life. For much of the 20th century, fashion magazines had sold aspiration through distance. They offered readers a world that was obviously separate from daily existence. Couture gowns, unreachable luxury, polished women who seemed to belong to another climate entirely. There was fantasy in that distance. A reader could admire it without fully expecting to become it. But by the 1990s, something had shifted. The imagery still belonged to elite industries, but it increasingly borrowed the visual language of ordinary youth culture. Bedrooms instead of ballrooms, bare apartments instead of palaces, slip dresses instead of sculpted evening wear, messy hair instead of lacquered perfection. This made the ideal feel closer, and in some ways more invasive. A glamorous woman in diamonds might be admired from afar. A girl in a plain tank top, looking pale and exhausted on an unmade bed, seemed almost reachable. The suggestion was subtle but powerful. This was not fantasy in the old sense. This was reality refined. It was intimacy turned into aspiration. That intimacy made imitation easier. It also made self-surveillance more intense. Young women did not need access to couture to participate. They needed restraint. They needed narrowness. They needed the right kind of studied indifference. The performance of effortless thinness could be attempted in bedrooms, school hallways, bathroom mirrors, university dormitories, and late-night conversations between friends pretending not to compare themselves while comparing everything. And this is where the era's beauty standard became psychologically sharper than many people remember. It was not simply about being thin. Western fashion had prized thinness long before the 1990s. What changed was the emotional atmosphere around it. Thinness was no longer always framed as polished self-improvement. It became tied to emotional coolness, sexual ambiguity, intellectual distance, and a refusal of obvious conventional femininity. To be visibly hungry, but never visibly wanting, became part of the aesthetic language. That contradiction is difficult to overstate. Hunger in ordinary life is vulnerable. It is bodily need. It is lack. But in this visual world, controlled hunger could be interpreted as superiority. Appetite itself, whether for food, comfort, warmth, or reassurance, was often made to seem unsophisticated. Discipline looked elegant. Need looked embarrassing. This did not remain safely inside editorial photography. It moved into conversation, into the way bodies were described, into compliments that were not really compliments. She looks amazing. She's so tiny. She can wear anything. She doesn't even look like she tries. Beneath those ordinary phrases sat a quiet moral system. Thinness was not just attractive. It suggested control. And control, especially for women, was repeatedly rewarded as virtue. At the same time, celebrity culture was becoming faster, more intimate, and more punishing. Tabloids, red carpets, paparazzi photography, and increasingly aggressive entertainment media created a new kind of public body scrutiny. Stars were no longer admired from a ceremonial distance. They were inspected constantly, leaving restaurants, stepping out of cars, buying coffee, existing in daylight. And the body became the central site of judgment. This mattered because celebrities helped translate runway aesthetics into public expectation. A look that might have remained confined to elite fashion became normalized when attached to actresses, musicians, and cultural icons whose faces were everywhere. Suddenly, the visual grammar of fragility was not only artistic, it was mainstream. A certain narrowness of shoulder, a certain visible rib line, a certain hollow around the eyes. These details became legible as signs of desirability rather than concern. There was also a racial dimension that deserves honesty, because fashion history often avoids it by speaking too generally. The dominant heroin chic ideal was overwhelmingly built around a narrow set of bodies, usually white, usually very young-looking, often deliberately styled to appear emotionally inaccessible and physically reduced. This was presented as universal sophistication, but it reflected highly specific cultural preferences and exclusions. Entire populations of women were asked to measure themselves against an ideal that was not only punishing, but structurally selective. This is one reason body standards can feel both personal and political at once. A person standing in front of a mirror may think she is having a private crisis of confidence. But the mirror is crowded. It contains industries, histories, race, class, money, advertising, and inherited rules about who gets to be seen as refined. The 1990s did not invent that system, but it gave it a particularly sharp silhouette. Even the language around wellness could become distorted. Publicly, health was still praised. Privately, the signals of thinness often overrode everything else. A person could be visibly exhausted, but if the silhouette fit the ideal, the exhaustion might be reinterpreted as elegance. Concern became confused with admiration, and fashion itself often protected this confusion by insisting on ambiguity. Designers and editors could claim they were pursuing mood, line, shape, atmosphere. They were not prescribing behavior, only creating images. But the body is never neutral material. When a certain form is rewarded again and again, the reward becomes instruction. This was especially true for aspiring models entering the industry. For them, the standard was not abstract at all. It was measured, discussed, negotiated in agencies, castings, and fittings. It existed in whispered warnings and practical decisions. Could the sample size fit? Would the designer complain? Did the photographer want sharper bones? Was the face too healthy-looking, too athletic, too womanly, too present? Many former models have described the era not as glamorous liberation, but as a climate of constant bodily management. Food reduced to arithmetic, hunger treated as professionalism, illness normalized as inconvenience rather than alarm. And here again the contradiction returns. The public saw images of effortless cool. The private machinery behind those images often involved relentless effort, fear, and surveillance. Fashion has always depended partly on illusion, but this particular illusion was unusually intimate because it asked people to believe that disappearance itself could be effortless. It is also worth remembering that the 1990s were a period of intense economic and cultural transition. Recession anxieties in some regions, changing media landscapes, post-Cold War uncertainty, urban cultural shifts, and a broader mood of skepticism all shape taste. The aesthetic of visible abundance could begin to feel politically or emotionally out of step. Minimalism, restraint, and stripped-down surfaces appeared more truthful to many people than the loud confidence of the previous decade. But minimalism in objects is not the same as minimalism in bodies. A clean white room is one thing. A body treated as a project of reduction is another. Yet culture often blurred the two. The same admiration for less, for cleaner lines, fewer ornaments, sharper edges, could slide quietly from furniture and architecture into flesh. This made bodily restriction feel modern rather than alarming. And once modernity enters the conversation, resistance becomes difficult. Nobody wants to feel outdated. Beauty standards survive not only because people desire them, but because people fear being left behind by them. Fashion, after all, is partly a language of belonging. To reject the dominant aesthetic can feel like rejecting social membership itself. Even those who consciously disliked the look often found themselves negotiating with it, because standards do not need unanimous approval to shape behavior. They only need enough cultural authority. There was also an especially uncomfortable overlap between the aesthetic and the growing public visibility of eating disorders. Discussions of anorexia and bulimia were becoming more present in media, though often in clumsy or moralizing ways. Awareness was rising, but so was visual normalization of extreme thinness. This created a moral tension that the culture struggled to resolve. Could an industry celebrate a body type while denying responsibility for the suffering associated with chasing it? Could a magazine condemn eating disorders in one feature and then reward near starvation in its fashion spreads the following month? Could concern and aspiration coexist on adjacent pages? Often they did. That contradiction was not accidental. It reflected a deeper cultural habit, wanting the image without confronting the cost. People were comfortable discussing the danger in theory, as long as the visual prestige remained intact. Sympathy could exist right beside admiration, each quietly canceling the other. The public arguments became louder as the decade moved forward. Critics pushed harder. Health professionals raised alarms. Parents worried about what daughters were learning from repetition. Some political figures even stepped into the debate, condemning what they saw as the glamorization of self-destruction. But fashion often responded with familiar defensiveness. The industry argued for artistic freedom, for complexity, for not reducing image-making to moral instruction. Some of that defense was legitimate. Art is not a public health brochure. But much of it also protected profit. Ambiguity can be very profitable when controversy increases attention without forcing structural change. And controversy did increase attention. Nothing spreads an aesthetic faster than moral panic mixed with fascination. The more people argued about heroin chic, the more the phrase itself became part of cultural vocabulary. It was criticized, but it was also branded. Named things travel faster. Meanwhile, the people most affected were often those with the least institutional power, Teenagers, young women, aspiring models, ordinary viewers learning to interpret themselves through a narrowing visual standard. They were not attending editorial meetings or approving ad campaigns. They were simply living downstream from them. A generation learned to read collarbones as messages. And yet, even within the height of the trend, there were fractures. Not everyone accepted the ideal. Alternative fashion scenes resisted it in different ways. Some designers preferred strength over frailty. Some photographers rejected the vacant stare and sought something warmer, stranger, or more physically grounded. Beauty standards are never total empires. They are unstable coalitions. Still, the dominant image had force, and force leaves traces. By the late 1990s, the conversation around the look was beginning to change again. Public discomfort was harder to dismiss. The glamour of visible fragility started to collide more directly with questions of responsibility. The rise of newer celebrity culture, changing commercial priorities, and growing criticism made the industry less comfortable defending the aesthetic in such explicit terms. But standards rarely disappear cleanly. They mutate. The language changes first, then the styling, then the justification. A look that once openly flirted with decay might be repackaged as wellness, discipline, clean living, or naturally lean elegance. The moral vocabulary shifts, but the demand for controlled thinness often survives underneath. This is one of the reasons the heroin chic era matters historically. It was not only a strange fashion moment trapped in old magazine pages. It revealed how easily culture can aestheticize harm when harm aligns with aspiration. It showed how quickly suffering can be translated into sophistication if the right people photograph it beautifully enough. And it left behind a question that still lingers. When does admiration stop being observation and become instruction? For the fashion industry, that question became harder to avoid as the faces associated with the era grew more famous, and as one particular model came to symbolize the entire mood more than anyone else. Not because she invented it alone, but because her image captured the contradiction perfectly. Vulnerable and untouchable, exhausted and magnetic, fragile and enormously powerful at the same time. To understand why the aesthetic became so culturally permanent, we have to move closer to that image, and to the woman whose face turned an industry mood into an international symbol. To understand why the aesthetic became so culturally permanent, we have to move closer to that image, and to the woman whose face turned an industry mood into an international symbol. In the public memory of the 1990s, no figure is more closely tied to heroin chic than Kate Moss. That association can be both useful and misleading. Useful because her photographs captured the era's visual grammar with unusual precision. Small frame, angularity, emotional distance, a kind of unfinished beauty that seemed to reject traditional glamour. Misleading because it risks turning a broad industrial system into a single face, as though one person invented an entire cultural appetite. She did not, but she became its most recognizable mirror. When Kate Moss emerged in the early 1990s, the contrast with the supermodel era was immediately visible. The late 1980s had celebrated towering presence. Figures like Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, and Claudia Schiffer represented a kind of polished magnificence. They looked powerful, expensive, and unmistakably constructed for spectacle. Their beauty was not pretending to be accidental. Kate Moss arrived as almost the opposite proposition. She was shorter than many runway expectations, physically slighter, less sculpted in the conventional sense, and often photographed in ways that emphasized not dominance but a strange kind of retreat. Her face could appear both youthful and tired at once. Her body looked less like the athletic luxury of the previous decade and more like something narrower, quieter, and harder to categorize. That ambiguity made her commercially powerful. Fashion often responds to contrast more strongly than to perfection. The industry was not simply searching for beauty. It was searching for a new sentence to write with the body. And here was a figure who allowed a different language entirely. She could be styled as vulnerable, cool, indifferent, intimate, even slightly uncomfortable to look at, and all of that felt modern. The famous early campaigns that helped define this shift, particularly the work associated with Calvin Klein, were not important only because they were widely seen. They mattered because they altered the emotional relationship between viewer and model. The imagery was stripped down, often minimal in setting, heavy with suggestion rather than display. Underwear campaigns and black-and-white photography created a sense of closeness that was both commercial and psychological. These were not images asking viewers to admire from across a ballroom. They were images asking viewers to feel as though they were intruding into private space. Bedrooms, bare walls, plain sheets, ordinary light. These details made the body feel accessible and vulnerable, while still remaining carefully curated. It was a new kind of luxury. Not excess, but apparent honesty. Or at least the appearance of honesty. That appearance mattered because authenticity was becoming one of the most valuable currencies of the decade. Youth culture increasingly distrusted obvious performance. Advertising learned quickly that selling rebellion could be more profitable than selling perfection. The model who looked like she had not been polished too carefully could feel more believable than the one who looked impossibly arranged. Of course, that believability was itself carefully manufactured. The natural look is often one of the most artificial constructions in fashion because it requires invisibility of labor. Hair must look as though nobody cared, but somebody did. Skin must look untouched, but the lighting is exact. Thinness must appear effortless, though effort may have structured every private routine behind it. The illusion works precisely because it hides the work. And this made the imagery particularly influential for ordinary viewers. If beauty looks obviously unattainable, people may admire it without fully internalizing it. But if beauty looks accidental, if it seems like a state of being rather than a performed result, it can create a far more intimate form of inadequacy. Why do I not look like that if she appears not to be trying? That silent question has shaped entire generations. In the case of Kate Moss, the cultural myth grew quickly. She was described not simply as beautiful, but as the embodiment of a new sensibility. Coolness attached itself to her image. So did contradiction. She could be presented as both anti-glamour and the center of glamour itself. She represented rebellion while becoming one of the industry's most profitable symbols. This is often how fashion handles resistance. It converts it into product. The more the aesthetic looked like a rejection of old standards, the more attractive it became to an industry that survives by selling newness. A model who seemed to stand outside traditional beauty rules could still be used to reinforce a new set of equally demanding rules. Difference itself became a commodity, and the public, as always, consumed both the image and the story around it. Stories matter because fashion is never just visual. It is narrative. People wanted not only the photographs, but the meaning attached to them. The idea of the mysterious girl, the downtown coolness, the emotional distance, the refusal of obvious approval, these became part of the product. Thinness alone was not enough. It had to be paired with attitude, with detachment, with the sense that beauty was almost an accident, discovered rather than pursued. That mythology had consequences, especially for young women trying to decode what adulthood required from them. Older glamour had often demanded performance. Be polished, be visibly desirable, be impressive. The heroin chic era often demanded concealment. Hide the effort, hide the hunger, hide the wanting. Be desirable, but appear uninterested in being desired. This was a more psychologically difficult standard because it asked for contradiction as personality. You were supposed to be looked at, but never look as though you wanted to be seen. And behind that contradiction sat an older cultural habit, the suspicion of female appetite in almost every form. Hunger for food, hunger for status, hunger for attention, hunger for pleasure. All of these could be subtly coded as vulgar if too visible. The ideal woman was often still imagined as one who managed desire so perfectly that it barely appeared at all. Heroin Chic did not invent that moral structure. It simply gave it a sharper, cooler aesthetic language. At the same time, the industry's relationship with actual drugs complicated the symbolism. The name itself invited moral panic, but it also reflected a real overlap between fashion mythology and broader cultural conversations about addiction, nightlife, and urban excess. The 1990s carried a persistent fascination with the edge clubs, late-night scenes, underground credibility, the visual residue of recklessness. But again, fashion preferred the image of danger to danger itself. There is a significant difference between living inside addiction and borrowing its signs as atmosphere. One destroys bodies. The other sells perfume, denim, and prestige. Yet the visual codes could be made to look almost interchangeable in the right photograph. This was one reason criticism became so intense. For families dealing with real addiction, the aestheticization felt cruel. For those dealing with eating disorders, it felt equally disturbing. What the industry called mood could look, from another angle, like a luxury version of suffering stripped of its consequences. And still, many people defended it because they recognized something emotionally true in the imagery. The decade itself often felt tired. Beneath economic optimism in some places, there was also alienation, disillusionment, and the beginning of a media environment that made self-comparison more constant. The photographs reflected a kind of emotional whether people recognized. This is important because beauty standards rarely succeed by pure invention. They usually work because they resonate with existing feelings. Heroin Chic was not persuasive simply because magazines declared it beautiful. It was persuasive because it matched a broader cultural mood of skepticism, distance, and controlled emotional exhaustion. It looked like how the decade sometimes felt. That does not make it harmless, but it helps explain why it lasted. There was also a distinctly gendered power dynamic in the way the look was discussed. Male photographers, designers, editors, and executives often had enormous influence over which bodies were rewarded, yet the burden of physically embodying the ideal fell overwhelmingly on women. The artistic argument was frequently made by people whose own bodies were not being measured against it. This imbalance mattered. When an aesthetic is framed as visionary rather than disciplinary, the people enforcing it can appear culturally sophisticated rather than morally implicated. The model is praised for professionalism. The creative director is praised for taste. The suffering disappears into abstraction. And abstraction is one of fashion's oldest shields. It allows industries to discuss ribs as lines, hunger as silhouette, fatigue as mood. Once translated into artistic vocabulary, the human body becomes easier to use and harder to defend. Some models later spoke openly about how normal this environment felt at the time. That may be one of the most unsettling details. Harmful systems often survive not because everyone agrees with them, but because they become ordinary. The fitting room conversation, the agency warning, the casual praise for visible thinness. The assumption that discomfort is simply the price of professionalism. When everyone around you treats the standard as normal, abnormality becomes invisible. And that normalization extended beyond modeling into everyday fashion culture. Diet culture, already powerful, found fresh aesthetic validation. Celebrity interviews casually discussed restrictive habits. Magazine advice framed bodily management as intelligence. Entire industries grew around helping ordinary people approximate a silhouette that was presented as both effortless and socially necessary. This was not always loud. Often it was quiet. Quiet standards are sometimes the hardest to resist because they feel like common sense rather than command. Eat less. take up less space, look like you are above needing very much. The message rarely had to be spoken directly. By the later 1990s, however, cracks were becoming more visible. Public criticism intensified, and some of it reached the highest levels of mainstream attention. When political figures and major newspapers began speaking openly about the dangers of glamorizing skeletal beauty, the industry could no longer pretend the conversation belonged only to niche critics. Even inside fashion, some people sensed the mood shifting. Commercial brands are rarely moral institutions, but they are highly sensitive to reputational risk. If a look becomes too publicly associated with death, addiction, or illness, it threatens profitability. And so the defense of the aesthetic became less confident. Not necessarily because the underlying values changed, but because the branding needed to. This is often how beauty standards evolve, not through moral revelation, but through strategic rephrasing. The same body may be desired under a new name. The same restriction may be described with healthier language. The same narrow ideal survives, but the story told about it changes. The late 1990s were moving toward one of those transitions. Fashion did not suddenly decide to love softness or abundance, but it began adjusting the public language around thinness. Strength could be marketed. Wellness could be marketed. Luxury could be made to look cleaner, less openly haunted by decay. Yet the old imagery had already done its work. It had shaped memory, aspiration, and private self-measurement. And perhaps most importantly, it had trained viewers to accept contradiction, to see a visibly diminished body and interpret not danger, but prestige. That lesson would not disappear just because the styling changed. If anything, it became more sophisticated. Because once an industry learns how to turn self-denial into aspiration, it rarely abandons the skill. It simply updates the costume. And as the century approached its end, the next version of that costume was already forming. Less openly tied to decay, more polished in public language, but still deeply concerned with discipline, control, and the moral performance of the body. To see how that transformation happened, we have to look at what came after the scandal. How fashion stepped away from the explicit image of collapse without ever fully letting go of the desire that had made collapse look beautiful in the first place. To see how that transformation happened, we have to look at what came after the scandal. How fashion stepped away from the explicit image of collapse without ever fully letting go of the desire that had made collapse look beautiful in the first place. Publicly, the late 1990s began to sound like a correction. There were sharper conversations about responsibility. Magazine editors were asked difficult questions. Designers faced criticism that could no longer be dismissed as moral panic from outsiders who simply didn't understand fashion. Health advocates, parents, and former models pushed the issue into mainstream discussion, and the visual language of Heroin Chic became harder to defend without discomfort. Even political language entered the conversation. When public figures condemned the glamorization of emaciation and drug-coated imagery, it signaled something important. The debate had escaped fashion's private rooms. It was now a cultural argument. That mattered because fashion can ignore criticism more easily when it stays inside the industry. Once the wider public begins to see a beauty ideal not as edgy sophistication but as social harm, brands become nervous. Advertising survives on desire, but it also survives on acceptability. No major company wants its campaign to become shorthand for moral failure. And so, without a dramatic formal announcement, the imagery began to shift. This is how most beauty revolutions actually happen, not with a clean ending but with gradual replacement. One season the face is hollow-eyed and ghostly. A few seasons later, the same magazines are speaking the language of vitality, freshness, glow, and athletic control. The bones remain, but the story changes. By the early 2000s, the industry had started to move away from the openly damaged look and toward something that appeared healthier on the surface. The body ideal was still narrow, often extremely so, but it was now wrapped in different moral packaging. Instead of decay, the fantasy leaned toward discipline. Instead of visible collapse, it suggested optimization. This distinction sounds small, but culturally it was enormous. Heroin Chic had made thinness feel rebellious, urban, and emotionally detached. The next phase made thinness feel responsible, clean, managed, a sign not of self-destruction, but of superior self-governance. That shift protected the ideal by making it harder to criticize. It is easier to object to the glamorization of visible suffering than to the celebration of health. Once the same restrictive body standard is explained through wellness language, opposition can sound irrational, even anti-health itself. Who could object to fitness, to discipline, to taking care of yourself? But words can conceal as much as they reveal. The body ideal of the early 2000s often still demanded extraordinary thinness. It simply preferred a different emotional narrative around it. Instead of the girl who looked like she had been out all night in a downtown apartment, the fantasy became the woman who looked as though she woke at 6, drank green juice, never lost control, and treated appetite as a personal management problem. The anxiety remained. It just wore better lighting. This is one of the most important continuities in beauty history. Standards rarely disappear. They become morally updated. Each generation is told its version is healthier, freer, more enlightened than the last. But underneath, the old rewards often remain surprisingly intact. Thinness still suggested status. Control still suggested virtue. Visible effort still needed to be hidden. Only the costume changed. Fashion magazines played a major role in this transition. Editorial language shifted from grit to glow. Articles that once celebrated downtown edge increasingly praised detoxes, routines, discipline, and balance, though balance often meant a highly unequal relationship with the body. Celebrity interviews became full of careful narratives about personal maintenance, Pilates, portion control, trainers, low-carb plans, routines disguised as lifestyle wisdom. The ideal body was now not just stylish, but morally organized. This reflected a broader cultural turn. The early 2000s saw a rising obsession with self-improvement culture, particularly for women. Beauty was tied more openly to responsibility. A body was increasingly treated as proof of character. If you looked controlled, you were assumed to be controlled. If you failed visibly, the failure could be moralized. This was not entirely new, but it became more commercial, more public, and more constant. Reality television, celebrity gossip media, and the internet accelerated this dramatically. Bodies were now discussed in real time. Before and after logic-dominated entertainment coverage. Weight gain became headline material. Weight loss became redemption arc. The body was no longer just aesthetic. It was narrative evidence. This made ordinary life feel strangely performative. People were not only trying to look attractive, they were trying to look like the kind of person who deserved approval. Thinness could imply discipline, intelligence, ambition, even emotional maturity. Softness could be read as failure, laziness, or lack of control. These judgments were often unfair, but they were culturally powerful. And perhaps the most exhausting part was how ordinary they became. A glance, comment at work, a celebrity cover, a casual conversation about someone letting themselves go. None of it had to sound dramatic. It simply had to be repeated often enough to become common sense. This is where the legacy of the heroin chic era remained strongest. Even after the explicit imagery faded, it had already helped normalize the idea that a diminished body could signal prestige. The next decade simply translated that lesson into a more socially acceptable language. Less death, more discipline, But discipline can be its own kind of quiet violence when it becomes a moral obligation rather than a personal choice. There was also a generational shift happening among consumers themselves. Women who had grown up under the most intense years of 1990s fashion messaging were now adults navigating careers, relationships, and increasingly digital self-comparison. Their understanding of beauty had been shaped by an era that treated hunger as elegance. Even when they consciously rejected that ideal, the emotional residue often remained. This is another reason beauty standards are historically powerful. They do not end when the magazines change. They settle into memory, into reflex, into the first thought someone has when trying on clothes alone. Fashion trends can be seasonal. Internalized judgment is not. And the internet made those judgments harder to escape. In earlier decades, fashion media still had gates. Magazines arrived monthly. Television had schedules. There were pauses. By the early 2000s and beyond, visual comparison became increasingly ambient. It followed people into homes, workplaces, late-night scrolling, quiet mornings, and sleepless hours. The mirror was no longer alone. It had company. This changed the emotional pressure of beauty standards in a profound way. Comparison became less ceremonial and more continuous. You did not visit aspiration occasionally. It visited you. Social media would later intensify this even further, but even before its full dominance, the logic was already forming. The body as permanent public project, always visible, always improvable, always failing slightly. In that environment, the moral language of wellness could be especially persuasive because it offered structure. If life felt unstable, control over the body could appear as one of the few available forms of certainty. Restriction could feel like competence. Routine could feel like safety. This is why beauty standards cannot be explained only through vanity. They are often entangled with fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of disorder. Fear of being judged. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of becoming invisible. The fashion industry did not invent those fears, but it learned how to profit from them with extraordinary efficiency. And yet, resistance also grew. Former models began speaking more openly about the pressures behind the images. Critics of diet culture gained wider audiences. Conversations around mental health, eating disorders, and representation slowly became harder to dismiss. Some designers and publications attempted genuine change, while others simply adapted their language. There were moments of visible reckoning. Debates over minimum BMI requirements for models, runway restrictions, and industry responsibility emerged in different countries. Some fashion weeks introduced rules. Some agencies adjusted standards. Some campaigns deliberately emphasized diversity or strength rather than extreme thinness. But reform was uneven. Industries built around image are remarkably skilled at symbolic compliance. A public statement is easier than structural change. One inclusive campaign does not undo years of visual training. A healthier runway policy does not erase the private conversations in castings, fittings, and contracts. The system could acknowledge the criticism while quietly preserving its preferences. And often it did. There is also an uncomfortable truth here. Many consumers participated willingly, even when they were harmed by the standard. Aspiration is rarely imposed by force alone. People can resent an ideal and still pursue it. They can understand the damage and still fear the social cost of stepping outside it. That contradiction should be treated with compassion, not mockery. Most people are not trying to become symbols of oppression. They are trying to survive social life, to be chosen, to be loved, to be left alone, to feel safe inside a body that the world keeps reading before it listens. Fashion works because it attaches those ordinary human desires to visual rules and then presents the rules as natural. And once a rule feels natural, it becomes difficult to remember that it was invented. This is why looking back at heroin chic matters beyond nostalgia or cultural criticism. It reveals the machinery. It shows how quickly an aesthetic can become morality, and how easily morality can be disguised as style. The decade is often remembered through a few familiar images: slip dresses, black and white campaigns, cigarette-thin silhouettes, tired eyes in different faces. But the deeper history is not really about a look. It is about what people were taught to admire in themselves and in each other: absence, control, refusal, reduction, and perhaps most strangely, it was about how often suffering became convincing only after it was made beautiful. By the time the 2000s settled into their own body politics, many of the harshest visual symbols of heroin chic had softened at the edges. But the emotional architecture was still standing. Thinness still promised social safety. Discipline still promised moral legitimacy. Beauty still asked, quietly and repeatedly, how much of yourself you were willing to subtract. The answer varied by person, by class, by race, by age, by industry. But the question remained. And nowhere was that question more brutally visible than in the private lives of models themselves. The young women whose bodies were treated not as symbols in theory, but as professional requirements in practice. Because while the public argued about campaigns and magazine covers, backstage and behind agency doors, another history was unfolding. Contracts, castings, weigh-ins, whispered instructions, and careers built on the understanding that the body was never entirely yours. To understand the full cost of the era, we have to leave the advertisement and step into the fitting room. To understand the full cost of the era, we have to leave the advertisement and step into the fitting room. Inside that space, the language changes. The mood boards, the campaigns, the carefully composed photographs all disappear, and what remains is something more practical, more immediate, and often more revealing. The fitting room is where the aesthetic stops being abstract and becomes measurable. It is where bodies are assessed not as symbols, but as materials that must meet exact requirements. Garments must close, seams must fall correctly, silhouettes must remain consistent across collections that travel from one city to another. And this is where the ideal reveals its most rigid form. Designers create clothing in what is known as sample size, a standardized set of measurements used during the development of a collection. These samples are not made to accommodate a wide range of bodies. Instead, the bodies must accommodate the samples. This reverses what many outside the industry might expect. Rather than clothing adapting to the wearer is expected to adapt to the clothing. In the 1990s and into the early 2000s, that expectation narrowed further. For models, especially those at the beginning of their careers, the fitting room was not simply a place of work. It was a place of evaluation. Agents, casting directors, designers, and stylists would observe quietly, sometimes with minimal comment, sometimes with a single sentence that carried enormous weight. She's a bit bigger than last season. The hips might be an issue. We need her sharper. The language was often understated, almost clinical, but the implications were clear. A fraction of an inch could determine whether a model was booked for a major show or quietly replaced. Careers could shift on details that were invisible to the public but decisive behind the scenes. This is where the calm aesthetic of heroin chic intersected with a far less calm reality. The appearance of effortless thinness often required constant monitoring. Meals became calculated. Schedules were arranged around maintaining a certain shape. Sleep, travel, stress, and physical health all interacted with the body in ways that could not be fully controlled, yet control was still expected. What made this environment particularly complex was how normalized it became. Many models entered the industry very young, sometimes in their mid-teens, often moving between countries, living away from family support, and learning quickly that their professional value was directly tied to their physical measurements. In that context, behaviors that might have raised alarm elsewhere could be reframed as discipline, commitment, or simply part of the job. The fitting room did not always require explicit instruction. Often, it did not need to. Silence can be one of the most powerful forms of pressure. A look exchanged between two people. Pause before a comment. A garment that almost fits but not quite. The awareness that another model is waiting, ready to take the place. All of these communicated expectations without needing to be spoken aloud. And because the aesthetic itself celebrated emotional distance, even discomfort could be absorbed quietly. The culture of coolness did not encourage complaint. To care too openly, to express hunger, fatigue, or distress, risked appearing unprofessional or, perhaps worse, out of alignment with the very image one was meant to embody. This created a subtle but persistent form of self-surveillance. Models were not only being observed by others, they learned to observe themselves constantly. The mirror became both tool and judge. Measurements were checked, sometimes daily. Clothing became a diagnostic instrument. The smallest change could be interpreted as a signal to adjust behavior. In this sense, the fitting room extended beyond its physical walls. It traveled into apartments, hotel rooms, airport lounges, and quiet moments before sleep. It shaped how food was seen, how time was structured, how the body was understood. The professional requirement became a personal habit, and over time, a private logic. This is one of the quieter ways an aesthetic becomes a system. It begins as an image, becomes a standard, and eventually settles into routine. And routines, once established, are difficult to question because they feel like part of life rather than something imposed from outside. There were, of course, variations in experience. Not every model lived under identical conditions, and not every agency enforced expectations in the same way. Some found ways to navigate the system without extreme restriction. Others struggled in ways that were less visible. But the structural pressures remained consistent enough to shape the overall culture. The body was a professional requirement first, and a personal space second. At the same time, the industry's global nature intensified these pressures. Fashion weeks moved from New York to London to Milan to Paris in rapid succession. Each city brought its own preferences, its own casting directors, its own interpretations of the ideal. A model might succeed in one location and struggle in another, not because her abilities changed, but because the measurements expected were slightly different, the mood slightly altered. This created a constant state of adjustment. There was rarely a stable point at which a model could feel secure. Even success carried its own anxiety because it needed to be maintained. The image that had been rewarded once could be reevaluated the next season. This instability reinforced the logic of control. If the standard is always moving, then the safest strategy appears to be further reduction, further discipline, further attention. The body becomes a project without a fixed endpoint. And here, the connection to the broader culture becomes clearer. While models experienced these pressures in a concentrated form, similar ideas were filtering outward. The same logic that the body must be continually improved, continually refined, continually reduced, appeared in everyday life, though often in softer language. Diet plans, fitness regimes, magazine advice columns, and later online content all echoed a version of this message. Not always explicitly, not always harshly, but persistently. There is always something to adjust. There is always something to correct. There is always a better version of the body just ahead. The difference was one of intensity, not of kind. And this is why the history of heroin chic cannot be separated from the history of ordinary self-perception. The fitting room and the mirror at home are connected by a shared vocabulary, even if the stakes feel different. For models, the stakes were often immediate and financial. For others, they were social, emotional, and psychological. But both were shaped by the same visual expectations. There is also an important detail that often goes unnoticed: the garments themselves. Clothing in high fashion is not neutral. It is designed with specific proportions in mind. Long lines, narrow waists, minimal volume. These features interact differently with different bodies. When the same clothing is shown repeatedly on extremely thin figures, it begins to define how the clothing is supposed to look. This creates a feedback loop. Designers create for a certain body. That body makes the clothing appear in a particular way. The appearance is praised. The praise reinforces the original design choice. Over time, the relationship between body and garment becomes fixed. Breaking that loop is difficult because it requires changing multiple parts of the system at once: design, production, casting, and consumer expectation. In the 1990s, that loop tightened rather than loosened. The minimalism of the era, with its clean lines and emphasis on silhouette, often worked most easily on very thin bodies. This did not mean other bodies could not wear the clothing, but it did mean that the ideal presentation, the one shown in magazines and on runways, favored a narrow range. And once that presentation becomes the reference point, everything else is judged against it. Even discomfort can be reframed as correctness. A garment that feels restrictive might be described as tailored. A body that must shrink to fit the garment might be described as disciplined. The language softens the reality, but the reality remains. There is also a quieter emotional dimension to the fitting room that is harder to document but just as important. Clothing has always been tied to identity. The act of trying something on is not purely physical. It is also interpretive. People look at themselves and ask, consciously or not, what this says about who they are. In an environment where the clothing is designed for a very specific body, that interpretive moment can become fraught. If the garment does not fit, what does that mean? In a healthier system, it would mean the garment is not the right size. In a more restrictive system, it can feel like a judgment on the body itself. For models, that interpretation is professionalized. For everyone else, it remains personal. But the emotional effect can be similar. This is how an aesthetic extends beyond the runway. It enters the quiet space where a person stands alone with a mirror, holding a piece of clothing, trying to decide what it means. And as the 1990s moved toward their final years, that quiet space was becoming increasingly crowded. Not just with fashion, but with media, with commentary, with comparison, with the growing presence of digital imagery that would soon transform the entire landscape. Because the fitting room, as powerful as it was about to be joined by something even more constant, more immediate, and more difficult to escape. A new kind of mirror was forming. One that did not stay in a single room, but followed people everywhere, reflecting not just their own bodies, but thousands of others at once. And as that mirror expanded, the lessons of the Heroin Chic era would not fade. They would adapt. They would adapt. The arrival of the internet did not invent body anxiety, but it changed its architecture completely. For most of the 20th century, beauty standards arrived in intervals. A magazine issue landed once a month. A television appearance happened at a scheduled hour. A billboard was passed and then left behind. Even when the standards were harsh, there were pauses between encounters. There was still a kind of distance between ordinary life and the machinery producing aspiration. That distance began to disappear. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, digital life was still in its early stages, but the logic was already shifting. Celebrity photographs spread faster. Entertainment gossip accelerated. Forums, blogs, and online communities created new spaces where bodies could be discussed with extraordinary intimacy and cruelty. The conversation no longer belonged only to editors and advertisers. Ordinary people were now participating in the surveillance, and participation changed everything. It is one thing to be shown an ideal. It is another to be asked constantly to publicly compare yourself to it. The early internet made that comparison strangely democratic. Everyone could comment. Everyone could judge. Everyone could become both audience and critic. This did not necessarily create new standards, but it intensified enforcement. Beauty was no longer simply broadcast from above. It was negotiated horizontally, through peer observation and endless informal ranking. Who looked better? Who had let themselves go? Who looked healthy, which often meant thin in the correct way? Who looked too thin, which often meant thin in the wrong way? These distinctions were never stable, but they were emotionally powerful. The body became conversational currency. Celebrity culture made this especially visible. Tabloid magazines had already turned weight fluctuation into public theater. But online culture removed even the small delay of print. Photographs appeared instantly. Commentary followed faster. Entire industries of humiliation and praise developed around visible bodily change. A woman could gain weight and become a cautionary story. She could lose weight and become a success narrative. She could remain unchanged and still be interpreted as either disciplined or failing, depending on the mood of the audience. The body was treated as evidence. And perhaps the strangest part was how ordinary this became. People who would never describe themselves as cruel could casually participate in these judgments because the culture framed them as observation rather than intrusion. Discussion of another person's body was treated almost like weather, constant, familiar, strangely impersonal. This normalization mattered because it extended the emotional logic of Heroin Chic into everyday speech. The aesthetic had taught viewers to see thinness as a form of intelligence, a sign of control and prestige. The internet taught them to perform that interpretation publicly and continuously. At the same time, a new kind of self-documentation was emerging. Before social media fully arrived, there was already a growing expectation that ordinary people should become visible in curated ways. Personal photos, early profile pages, blogs, online identity, these created a subtle pressure to think of the self as an image before the self had fully learned how to live with that image. This sounds abstract, but its consequences were intimate. A person standing in front of a mirror was no longer only deciding how they felt. They were beginning to imagine how they would appear to others in digital space. The body was becoming not just something lived in, but something managed for circulation. This management encouraged a particular form of consciousness, anticipatory self-judgment. How will this look? What will this suggest? Do I appear disciplined enough? Attractive enough? Effortless enough? The performance of effortlessness became even more exhausting when it had to be maintained not just in private life, but in visible personal archives. The old-fashioned photograph had offered a fantasy. The new digital environment asked ordinary people to produce their own. And because the standard of beauty had already been shaped by decades of reduction and control, the self-produced image often followed the same emotional rules. Take up less space. Look calm. Look managed. Look like you are above needing too much. Even happiness had to be styled carefully. This is one of the quiet legacies of the era. Beauty standards did not simply tell people how to look. They taught people how to narrate themselves morally. Thinness implied competence. Restraint implied intelligence. Visible appetite, whether for food, attention, pleasure, or comfort, still risked looking excessive. The internet rewarded curation, and curation often rewarded the same old disciplines under new names. There was also a shift in the commercial language around food itself. By the early 2000s, the wellness industry was expanding rapidly. This deserves careful attention because it was not purely cynical. Many people genuinely wanted healthier lives, better medical understanding, and more thoughtful relationships with their bodies. But alongside that legitimate interest, another moral system was growing. one that treated food less as nourishment and more as evidence of character. Good foods, bad foods, clean eating, cheat days, guilt, virtue. This language gave moral weight to ordinary appetite. And once food becomes moralized, hunger becomes morally charged too. To resist hunger can feel righteous. To satisfy it can feel like failure. This is not identical to the heroin chic era, but it shares its deeper logic. The disciplined body is treated as proof of personal worth. The aesthetic changed. The emotional structure remained. Fashion and wellness began to overlap in revealing ways. Thinness no longer needed the dark glamour of downtown exhaustion, could arrive smiling, carrying yoga mats and speaking the language of balance. But the body ideal underneath often remained remarkably familiar. It was still narrow, still controlled, still suspicious of softness, still more praised when appetite appeared absent. This is why historians of beauty often caution against assuming progress simply because the imagery looks brighter. Harm does not always arrive looking harsh. Sometimes it arrives looking responsible. Sometimes it arrives with better branding. At the same time, resistance movements were learning new language as well. Critics of diet culture, writers on body politics, and people speaking openly about eating disorders began to challenge not only the old heroin chic imagery, but the newer moral packaging of wellness. The argument became more sophisticated. The question was no longer only, why are we glamorizing visible fragility? It became, why are we still rewarding the same restrictive body, even when we claim the values have changed? That question unsettled the industry because it reached beneath surface aesthetics and into structure. It forced fashion, media, and consumers alike to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the problem was not one trend, one decade, or one scandalous campaign, but a much longer cultural habit of linking female virtue to controlled disappearance. And once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee. The 1920s had their own version. The post-war decades had another. The aerobics years of the 1980s translated it differently. The heroin chic 1990s gave it a colder silhouette. The wellness-focused 2000s polished it into responsibility. Different costumes, familiar discipline. This continuity does not mean history is hopeless. It means history is layered. Every era claims novelty, but older moral structures often survive inside the new language. That realization can be strangely freeing, because it reveals that beauty standards are not natural laws. They are cultural arrangements designed, rewarded, defended, and therefore capable of being challenged. But challenge is difficult when profit depends on insecurity. And insecurity remains one of the most profitable emotional states in modern life. If a person can be persuaded that their body is always slightly unfinished, they remain an ideal customer. There is always another product, another routine, another correction waiting just ahead. Completion would be bad for business. This is why fashion and beauty industries rarely sell satisfaction. They sell proximity to satisfaction. Enough hope to continue purchasing, never enough peace to stop. The heroin chic era, despite its severity, was part of that larger commercial story. It was one particularly sharp expression of a much older mechanism, teaching people to associate self-erasure with social reward. And that mechanism became even more intimate as social media entered full force. Platforms built around images transformed comparison into a daily reflex. Filters, angles, editing tools, influencer culture, these did not create insecurity from nothing, but they industrialized it. They turned private discomfort into measurable engagement. Likes, views, comments, before and after transformations, glow-ups, body checks disguised as lifestyle content. The language became casual, but the emotional stakes remained serious. Young people growing up inside this environment inherited not only the images of heroin chic, but its deeper assumptions. sometimes without even knowing where they came from. A body should be controlled. Hunger should be hidden. Beauty should look effortless. Discipline should be visible, but never the labor behind it. History leaves traces like that. People often imagine cultural eras ending cleanly, but they rarely do. They survive in habits, compliments, fears, and mirror rituals passed quietly from one generation to the next. And perhaps nowhere is that inheritance more visible than in the way people still talk about that 90s look with a mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. Because memory itself can be seductive. Looking back, the photographs are often framed as iconic, minimalist, artistically significant. And many of them were visually powerful. That should not be denied. The danger lies in forgetting the conditions underneath them, in remembering only the elegance of the image and not the bodies required to sustain it. Style can make memory selective. It allows suffering to return as aesthetic appreciation. A generation later, people may admire the dress, the silhouette, the mood, the beautiful emptiness of the frame, without asking what private cost made that emptiness possible. This is why historical honesty matters. Not to flatten the past into moral lessons, but to resist the temptation to romanticize harm simply because it was photographed beautifully. The Heroin Chic era was not only a strange chapter of fashion history. It was a case study in how culture learns to admire disappearance, and how difficult it becomes to separate beauty from the systems that teach us what beauty means. And yet, even in the middle of that system, there were people pushing back from inside it. Models refusing certain expectations, editors questioning familiar assumptions, designers rethinking what elegance could look like. Those quieter acts rarely become iconic in the same way the photographs do, but they matter, because history does not only move through dominant images. It also moves through resistance, often small at first, often easy to overlook. And in the years after Heroin Chic became a recognizable phrase, that resistance began to gather enough force that the industry could no longer treat it as background noise. What happened next was not a clean victory, but it was a turning point. Fashion was forced, however reluctantly, to confront the question it had avoided for decades. What responsibility does an image carry once the world starts living inside it? What responsibility does an image carry once the world starts living inside it? For much of fashion history, the industry had answered that question by avoiding it. Beauty was treated as separate from consequence. A photograph was art, a runway was performance, a campaign was atmosphere. If viewers interpreted those images too seriously, that was framed as a misunderstanding. Fashion preferred to imagine itself as suggestion rather than instruction, even while building entire economies around desire and imitation. But by the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, that separation became harder to defend. Too many people had lived inside the consequences. Parents watched daughters negotiate food and self-worth through magazine pages. Former models described professional environments built on constant bodily reduction. Public health conversations around eating disorders became too visible to dismiss as isolated tragedy. The aesthetic of fragility could no longer be protected by the claim that it was merely visual experimentation. The image had entered ordinary life. And once that happened, responsibility could no longer remain an abstract philosophical question. It became institutional. Should agencies be allowed to demand certain measurements without scrutiny? Should fashion weeks impose health standards? Should magazines be expected to consider the cumulative effect of what they repeatedly reward? These were not simple questions, and the industry resisted simple answers. Part of that resistance came from genuine complexity. Bodies are different. Thinness alone does not reveal health. Art should not be reduced to public service messaging. There was truth in these arguments. But complexity can also be used as camouflage. It can protect a system by making change sound impossible. If every standard is too complicated to question, the standard survives untouched. Still, pressure was building. In several countries, especially across Europe, discussions about model health became increasingly public. Concerns around eating disorders and extreme thinness pushed governments, fashion councils, and major events to consider rules that would have seemed unlikely a decade earlier. The question was no longer whether the industry influenced people. It was what, if anything, should be done about it. This is where fashion encountered one of its oldest contradictions. It depends on exclusivity, but it also wants moral legitimacy. It wants to present itself as a place of artistic freedom while still being accepted as culturally respectable. When criticism threatens that respectability, reform becomes attractive, not always because values change, but because reputation matters. Some of the first visible reforms focused on the runway itself. There were debates over minimum body mass index requirements for models. Some fashion weeks introduced restrictions after high-profile public concern, particularly following tragedies involving models whose deaths intensified scrutiny around industry standards. Suddenly, a conversation that had often remained private, measurements, casting pressure, bodily expectation, became part of newspaper headlines. That visibility mattered. Once a practice becomes publicly legible, it loses some of its protective invisibility. What had once been treated as ordinary backstage logic could now be interpreted as institutional responsibility. But reform through numbers is always limited. A BMI rule may look decisive, but bodies are not moral equations. Health cannot be fully measured by a single statistic, and industries skilled at preserving appearances can learn to comply symbolically without changing deeper habits. A runway can announce standards while casting rooms continue to reward the same silhouette. The body ideal can survive regulation by learning better manners. This is why many critics remain skeptical. They understood that the problem was not only a number. It was an entire visual economy that linked prestige to reduction. Unless that emotional logic changed, policy alone would struggle. And emotional logic is much harder to legislate. You can regulate measurements more easily than you can regulate admiration. Magazines could publish healthier language while still placing the same narrow bodies on their covers. Designers could speak about diversity while quietly preferring the familiar silhouette that made garments fall correctly. Consumers could praise body positivity while privately continuing to trust thinness as the safest form of social approval. The system was adaptive. This is often how powerful cultural standards survive criticism. They do not refuse change completely. They absorb it, soften their vocabulary, and continue. A body once praised for looking destructive can later be praised for looking disciplined. The reward remains. Only the justification evolves. At the same time, however, something genuinely important was changing outside the institutions themselves. People were learning to name the pattern. Naming matters. Before a system is named, it often feels like private failure. A person believes their anxiety belongs only to them. Their discomfort in a fitting room feels personal, not historical. Their relationship with food feels like individual weakness rather than participation in a larger moral structure. But once the pattern becomes visible, shame can begin to loosen. Writers, activists, therapists, and people speaking openly about eating disorders helped create that visibility. They shifted the conversation from individual discipline to structural expectation. They asked not simply why someone hated her body, but what kind of culture taught her to interpret her body that way. That was a profound change. It moved the discussion away from vanity and toward power. Because beauty standards are not trivial. They shape time, money, emotion, health, and social belonging. They decide who is treated as competent, desirable, employable, or morally respectable. They enter medicine, hiring, romance, education, and family life. To call them superficial is often a way of protecting how deeply they operate. The heroin chic era made that depth impossible to ignore because its imagery was so visibly stark. It took the underlying logic and made it photographically obvious. But the same logic could live quietly in far more ordinary places. A mother praising weight loss at the dinner table. A doctor dismissing pain because a patient looks healthy. A friend describing someone as so good for skipping dessert. A workplace complimenting visible exhaustion as dedication. None of these require a runway, yet they belong to the same moral language. This is one reason the industry's later embrace of body positivity was both hopeful and complicated. On one level, broader representation mattered. Seeing different bodies in public visual culture can genuinely alter what feels imaginable. Campaigns that included more varied sizes, ages, and appearances challenged the assumption that beauty belonged only to one narrow form. That change should not be dismissed. But representation can also become branding. A company can sell liberation while quietly relying on the same insecurity to drive profit. A campaign celebrating self-love can still be built inside a system that depends on self-correction. Inclusion can be real and commercial at the same time. This ambiguity frustrated many people because it felt like progress and performance were happening together. And often they were. Fashion rarely changes through purity. It changes through pressure, compromise, profit, backlash, and slow cultural exhaustion with old lies. That process is messy. It does not produce clean heroes. Even the models most associated with difficult standards were often navigating limited choices rather than designing the rules themselves. A young woman rewarded for thinness is not automatically the architect of the system. She may be surviving inside it, benefiting from it, harmed by it, and helping reproduce it all at once. History is often morally untidy like that. It is easier to blame a face than to examine a structure. But structures matter more. This is why focusing only on heroin chic as a visual style can be misleading. The cigarettes, the slip dresses, the pale skin, the vacant stare. These are memorable symbols, but they are not the deepest story. The deeper story is the repeated cultural belief that a woman's social value increases as evidence of need decreases. Need less, eat less, want less, take up less room. The aesthetic changed across decades, but that instruction remained startlingly stable. And perhaps that is why the era still feels emotionally alive to people who did not even live through it. They recognize the logic because some version of it still exists around them. Maybe it arrives through fitness culture instead of fashion editorials. Maybe through algorithm-driven beauty advice instead of glossy magazines. Maybe through workplace expectations disguised as self-care. But the emotional lesson feels familiar. Disappearance can still be rewarded. The difference now is that more people are willing to question it. That questioning has changed fashion in ways both visible and invisible. Runways are not identical to what they were in the 1990s. Magazine language is more careful. Conversations around mental health and eating disorders are less easily pushed aside. Younger audiences are often more fluent in identifying manipulation, even while still vulnerable to it. Awareness is not immunity, but it matters. Creates friction. And friction is often how cultural change begins, not through sudden revolution, but through enough people refusing to accept the old script as natural. Still, fashion remains extraordinarily powerful because it does not only sell clothes. It sells permission and exclusion. It tells people who gets to belong to the future. That is why the body matters so much inside it. The body becomes proof of whether you are keeping up with time itself. To be out of shape can feel emotionally like being out of history. This sounds dramatic, but many people experience it quietly every day. A trend changes. A silhouette shifts. A familiar body suddenly feels culturally outdated. fashion transforms that discomfort into commerce with remarkable speed. And yet every beauty era eventually reveals its own absurdities. The corseted ideal of one century looks impossible to the next. The sunken glamour of heroin chic becomes difficult to defend. The clean perfection of wellness culture begins to look like another form of control. What feels timeless is often only temporary prestige wearing confidence. That recognition can be liberating. It reminds us that beauty standards are not truths discovered about the body. They are preferences arranged into power. The 1990s simply made one version unusually visible. A body that looked tired, fragile, reduced, and emotionally distant became a symbol of sophistication. Millions absorbed that lesson, whether they admired it, feared it, or tried to survive beside it. And even after the explicit imagery faded, the logic remained alive enough to reshape the decades that followed. Which brings us to one final uncomfortable detail of the era, perhaps the quietest and most revealing of all. Many of the people who most strongly criticized heroin chic had once admired it. Editors who later condemned it had published it. Consumers who later called it harmful had once clipped the photographs. Industries that later marketed wellness had profited from thinness all along. This is not hypocrisy so much as a reminder of how persuasion works. Harmful beauty standards rarely announce themselves as harm. They arrive looking like taste, intelligence, elegance, and modernity. People participate because they want beauty, belonging, and approval, not because they consciously choose damage. That is why looking back requires humility. It is easy to mock the past as if we would have stood outside it untouched. Much harder is asking which standards of our own time will look equally strange, equally cruel, equally obvious in hindsight. What are we currently calling discipline that future generations will recognize as fear? What are we praising as wellness that may actually be anxiety with better branding? Those questions do not belong only to the 1990s. They belong to every era that turns the body into evidence of moral worth. And as fashion moved into the new millennium, carrying old lessons beneath new language, the industry was forced to confront those questions not just in criticism, but in commerce itself. Because once audiences begin to distrust the fantasy must either change or learn how to hide itself more convincingly. And in the early years of the new millennium, fashion chose to do both at once. On the surface, there was visible adjustment. Campaigns appeared brighter. Faces looked more alert. Skin seemed healthier, more luminous, less deliberately shadowed. The emotional tone shifted away from the quiet exhaustion of the 1990s toward something that suggested energy, movement, and control. It was not exactly joy, but it was no longer openly hollow. This was not a rejection of thinness. It was a refinement of its presentation. The body ideal did not suddenly become broader or more forgiving. Instead, it became better explained. Where heroin chic had relied on ambiguity and mood, the new aesthetic relied on justification. The same narrow frame could now be framed as the result of discipline, routine, balance, and care. The difference was not in the silhouette, but in the story told about it. And stories matter because they shape how people interpret what they see. A body that looks depleted can provoke concern. A body that looks controlled can provoke admiration. The physical reality may not be radically different, but the emotional response shifts depending on the narrative attached to it. Fashion understood this instinctively. It learned to move the conversation away from what the body looked like and toward why it supposedly looked that way. This is where the language of lifestyle became central. Magazines began to fill their pages not only with images, but with routines. What models ate, how they exercised, how they managed stress, how they maintained their appearance while claiming not to be consumed by it. The model was no longer just a face or a body. She was a system of habits, choices, and self-regulation. And that system could be imitated. This is one of the most significant developments in the history of beauty standards. When an ideal is presented as a mysterious accident, it can be admired from a distance. But when it is presented as a series of achievable steps, it becomes a project. Something to work toward, something to measure progress against. The body becomes a schedule. Wake up early, drink water, exercise consistently, avoid certain foods, control portions, stay disciplined, never appear obsessive. That last instruction is the most difficult, and perhaps the most revealing, because the performance of control must always look effortless. Too much visible effort breaks the illusion. The ideal body must appear as the natural result of good choices, not the outcome of relentless attention. This creates a paradox. Intense discipline must be hidden behind the appearance of ease. The 1990s had already established this logic. The 2000s refined it. And as this refinement spread, it began to reshape not only how bodies were seen, but how time itself was experienced. Daily life became organized around maintenance. Meals, movement, rest, and even leisure were evaluated through the lens of self-optimization. The body was no longer just an object of style. It was an ongoing project of management. This had a particular effect on how people thought about failure. If the body is treated as a project, then any deviation from the ideal can feel like a mistake, a missed routine, a lapse in discipline, something that could have been prevented with better choices. This shifts the emotional burden away from the system and onto the individual. The standard remains strict, but the responsibility becomes personal. This is why the newer language was so effective. It allowed the same expectations to continue while appearing more humane. After all, who could object to taking care of oneself? To being disciplined? To making good decisions? But care and control are not always the same thing. And in many cases, the line between them became blurred. The commercial world reinforced this blur. Products multiplied. Fitness programs expanded. Wellness brands promised transformation through consistency and self-awareness. The message was rarely aggressive. It did not need to be. It simply needed to suggest that improvement was always possible, always necessary, always just slightly out of reach. This created a subtle but constant pressure. There is always one more adjustment to make, one more habit to refine, one more version of the body that might finally feel complete. Completion, however, remained elusive, because a completed body would not need the system anymore. And a system that depends on ongoing consumption cannot easily allow its audience to feel finished. So the ideal remained just distant enough to keep people engaged. At the same time, the visual field continued to evolve. Digital photography improved. Editing tools became more accessible. Images could be altered with increasing precision. Imperfections could be smoothed, proportions adjusted, lighting enhanced, all without leaving visible traces. This introduced another layer of complexity. The body being admired was not always the body that existed. In the 1990s, manipulation certainly existed, but it was less widely understood. By the 2000s, editing became both more common and more invisible. This made the ideal even harder to locate, because it was no longer tied strictly to physical reality. It could be adjusted after the fact, refined in ways that no routine could fully replicate. And yet the language of effort persisted. Viewers were still told that discipline could produce the result they were seeing, even when that result had been digitally enhanced. This widened the gap between expectation and possibility, often without acknowledging the gap itself. It is difficult to compete with an image that has been perfected beyond the limits of the body. But competition continued, because the image still appeared natural. This is another quiet inheritance from the heroin chic era, the expectation that beauty should look unconstructed, even when it is carefully engineered. The more invisible the construction, the more persuasive the image becomes. And so the cycle deepened. The industry presented an ideal. The audience attempted to approach it. The image was adjusted to remain just ahead. The audience adjusted again. Movement without arrival. There were moments when this cycle was challenged directly. Investigations into digital retouching. Campaigns that attempted to show unedited bodies. Public discussions about unrealistic standards. Some brands even began to use these critiques as part of their identity, positioning themselves as more honest, more transparent, more aligned with real bodies. These efforts mattered, but they existed within a larger system that was slow to change. Because the desire for an ideal does not disappear simply because it is questioned. It becomes more complex. People may intellectually reject unrealistic standards while still emotionally responding to them. They may critique the image and still feel its pull. This is not weakness. It is the result of repetition. What we see often enough begins to feel normal, even if we know it has been constructed. And the new millennium increased that repetition dramatically. Images were no longer confined to specific spaces. They were everywhere, on screens, in advertisements, in personal profiles, in constant circulation. The body became one of the most visible and most evaluated elements of identity. This made self-perception more unstable. A person could see dozens, even hundreds of curated bodies in a single day, each one presented as effortless, each one suggesting a slightly different version of the ideal. The standard was no longer singular. It was fragmented, but consistently narrow. Different styles, different aesthetics, the same underlying discipline. This fragmentation made resistance more difficult because there was no single standard to reject. Instead, there was a field of variations all pointing in a similar direction. Choose your version of thinness. Choose your version of control. Choose your version of effortlessness. But always choose something that aligns with the system. And yet, even within this complexity, something else was happening quietly. Fatigue. Not the aesthetic fatigue of the 1990s, but a cultural fatigue with the endlessness of the project. With the feeling that the body could never be complete, never be enough, never be allowed to rest outside the logic of improvement. This fatigue began to surface in different ways. In humor, in criticism, in small refusals, in alternative aesthetics that valued comfort, softness, or unpredictability. These were not dominant trends, but they signaled something important. The system was not absolute. People could see it. They might still participate, but they were beginning to recognize the rules they were following. That recognition did not dismantle the structure, but it introduced a kind of awareness that made the structure less invisible. And once a system becomes visible, it becomes possible to imagine it differently. Not necessarily to escape it entirely, but to negotiate with it, to question it, to refuse parts of it, to create small spaces of distance. Fashion, in response, continued to evolve. It incorporated critique into its language. It experimented with new forms of representation. It adjusted its tone, its imagery, its messaging. But beneath these changes, the central tension remained. How do you sell beauty without creating dissatisfaction? How do you define an ideal without excluding most bodies? How do you maintain desire without intensifying insecurity? There are no easy answers to those questions. And perhaps that is why the history of the heroin chic era continues to matter. Not because it was uniquely extreme, but because it made the underlying logic so visible. It revealed how quickly an aesthetic can turn into a system, how deeply that system can shape ordinary life, and how difficult it is to change once it has been absorbed into everyday habits. As the early 21st century moved forward, carrying both the legacy of the 1990s and the pressures of a digital world, fashion did not abandon its old instincts. It refined them, it disguised them, it reintroduced them in forms that felt more acceptable, more modern, more aligned with the language of care and self-improvement. But the question remained, quietly persistent beneath every new campaign and every new standard. Not what does this body look like, but what does it cost to look like this? And in the years that followed, that question would begin to return in more direct, more public, and more unavoidable ways, as both the industry and its audience were forced to confront not just the image, but the invisible labor and quiet compromises that sustained it. And in the years that followed, that question would begin to return in more direct, more public, and more unavoidable ways, as both the industry and its audience were forced to confront not just the image, but the invisible labor and quiet compromises that sustained it. Because every beauty standard, no matter how elegant it appears in a photograph, is upheld by ordinary repetition. It is upheld in kitchens and fitting rooms, in backstage corridors and doctors' offices, in agency contracts and teenage bedrooms, in the private rituals nobody sees and the public compliments everyone remembers. The glamour of Heroin Chic was never only in the campaign itself. It lived in the countless small decisions made afterward by people trying to move closer to what they believed beauty required. That is where the true history sits, not only on the runway, but at the dinner table. Food became one of the most emotionally loaded spaces in this story, and not simply because of dieting. Food is never only biological. It carries class, comfort, celebration, control, memory, guilt, family, and identity. To regulate food is often to regulate far more than appetite. This is why beauty standards become so intimate so quickly. When a culture repeatedly rewards thinness, eating stops feeling neutral. Meals become moral territory. Hunger becomes a negotiation between bodily need and social meaning. A person may be deciding what to have for lunch, but underneath that ordinary moment are decades of inherited judgment. Should I be good today? Have I earned this? Will people notice? These thoughts sound small, but multiplied over years, they shape entire lives. The Heroin Chic era sharpened that relationship by attaching prestige to visible reduction. But what followed in the 2000s and beyond made the emotional discipline even more persistent because it translated the same pressure into everyday virtue. Restriction no longer had to look rebellious or artistic. Could simply look responsible. This made refusal harder. To reject Heroin Chic as an aesthetic was possible because it looked dramatic. To reject a culture that praises discipline, self-management, and healthy choices is far more complicated, because those values are not inherently wrong. The difficulty lies in how easily care becomes surveillance. This is why so many people describe their relationship with food not as a single crisis, but as a low, constant conversation in the background of life. A running commentary, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but rarely absent. Fashion helped write that commentary, but it was reinforced by medicine, celebrity culture, workplace norms, and family language. A person could leave the magazine behind and still encounter the same logic at home. You look great. Have you lost weight? I'm being bad today. I need to be good this week. She's so disciplined. These phrases sound harmless because they are ordinary, but ordinary language is often where systems become permanent. Once morality enters appetite, the body becomes a daily referendum on character. And character is much harder to argue with than style. No one wants to feel irresponsible. No one wants to feel weak. If thinness can be linked to discipline and discipline to moral worth, then beauty becomes something deeper than appearance. It becomes a social test. This is part of why the legacy of Heroin Chic endured long after the specific imagery faded. The visual style changed, but the moral structure remained useful. It organized behavior. It rewarded compliance. It made self-monitoring feel like maturity. And perhaps most powerfully, it made suffering interpretable as success. Someone skipping meals might be seen not as struggling, but as committed. Someone exhausted might be praised for dedication. Someone visibly diminishing might receive admiration disguised as concern. The line between alarm and approval could become dangerously thin. This was especially true in professional environments beyond fashion. Offices, universities, and social circles often carried the same hidden admiration for self-erasure. Busyness became status. Exhaustion became competence. Hunger became discipline. The body reflected not only beauty standards, but broader ideas about productivity and worth. To be visibly comfortable could even seem suspicious. Rest implied laziness. Softness implied lack of ambition. Pleasure implied loss of control. In that sense, Heroin Chic was never only about fashion. It belonged to a larger modern admiration for denial, an idea that the best people are the ones who can need the least. Less food, less sleep, less emotional reassurance, less visible desire. The elegant person, the successful person, the admirable person, so often imagined as someone who takes up very little room. That idea reaches far beyond the runway, and once you begin to notice it, it appears everywhere. It appears in the praise of low-maintenance women, in the suspicion toward visible female anger, in the expectation that beauty should seem effortless, motherhood selfless, ambition polite, aging invisible. The body becomes the most visible proof of whether someone has learned these rules. This is why many feminist critics looked at Heroin Chic not as an isolated trend, but as a particularly stark expression of a much older pattern, the social reward attached to female reduction. The ideal woman is often not the one who lives most fully, but the one who disturbs least. She is beautiful but not demanding, successful but not threatening, present but somehow still small. Heroin Chic gave that old expectation a 1990s silhouette: sharp bones, tired eyes, emotional distance, but the structure underneath was familiar. And once that structure is recognized, the question changes. Instead of asking why one decade preferred one body type, we begin asking why cultures repeatedly find ways to make female self-erasure look virtuous. That question is more uncomfortable because it does not allow us to dismiss the era as merely strange fashion. It forces us to examine continuity. Why do so many standards across different generations reward lessness? Why is appetite, literal or metaphorical, so often treated as something to be managed rather than trusted? Why does taking up space still require explanation? These are not questions fashion can answer alone, but fashion visualizes them with unusual clarity. That is why runway images matter historically. They are not just clothes. They are public diagrams of what a culture finds admirable. And in the 1990s, one of those diagrams suggested that beauty could look like controlled disappearance. The backlash against that idea was real, but backlash is not the same as transformation. Many people rejected the imagery while quietly preserving the logic. They no longer wanted the haunted face, perhaps, but they still trusted the disciplined body. They no longer admired the obvious signs of depletion, but they still admired the evidence of restraint. The ideal simply learned to smile. This is part of what made the 2010s so culturally complicated. Public conversations about self-love, body positivity, and representation became louder and more mainstream. At the same time, social media intensified self-surveillance to a level previous decades could barely imagine. People were told to love themselves while being shown thousands of edited bodies every week. They were told beauty standards were expanding while algorithms still rewarded familiar shapes. They were told confidence mattered most while still learning, almost instantly, which appearances generated the most approval. Contradiction became the atmosphere, and contradiction is exhausting. It asks people to be liberated and controlled at once, to reject the standard while still understanding it perfectly, to perform confidence without stepping too far outside the invisible boundaries of acceptability. This is why many people feel both more aware and more trapped than earlier generations. Awareness alone does not dissolve pressure. Sometimes it simply makes the pressure more articulate. You know the image is edited. You know the standard is constructed. You know the compliment is tied to weight loss. And still, your first thought in the mirror may belong to the old system. History lives there, in reflex, not only in memory. This is why older beauty eras continue to matter. They are not dead. They remain active inside habits that feel personal but were culturally taught. A woman in 2026 may never have seen a 1990s Calvin Klein campaign directly, but she may still inherit its emotional lessons through everything built afterward. Through the language of clean eating, through influencer wellness culture, through compliments about looking tiny, through the assumption that visible appetite requires apology. History often travels that way quietly through language, and language can be remarkably difficult to escape because it shapes thought before thought feels chosen. What counts as letting yourself go? What counts as taking care of yourself? What counts as looking put together? These phrases sound neutral, but they are full of inherited judgment. The heroin chic era made some of those judgments unusually visible because it was aesthetically extreme. Looking back, the photographs can seem almost too obvious, too severe, too openly attached to depletion. That visibility can create a false comfort. We tell ourselves we would never repeat something so blatant. We imagine progress as distance from the most dramatic version of harm. But cultural systems rarely return in identical form. They return disguised as improvement. They return with cleaner branding, better lighting, kinder language. That is why the history matters. Not so we can simply condemn the 1990s, but so we can recognize the mechanism when it reappears under a new name. Because it always asks roughly the same question. How much of yourself are you willing to subtract in exchange for approval? Every era answers differently, but the bargain is familiar. And the fashion industry, perhaps more than any other cultural machine, has long understood how to make that bargain feel elegant. It does not force. It suggests. It does not command. It rewards. It does not say disappear. It says refine. That subtlety is its genius and its danger. By the time people realize they are negotiating with their own hunger, the rules often feel like common sense rather than history. And yet, history can be interrupted. The most meaningful shifts rarely begin with a campaign. They begin when enough people stop interpreting suffering as sophistication. When enough people refuse to call exhaustion beautiful. When enough people decide that a body is not a moral resume. Those changes are slow. They are uneven. They are constantly challenged by profit and nostalgia and the seductive power of old images. But they matter, because if heroin chic taught an entire culture to admire disappearance, then the real counterhistory is not simply different fashion. It is a different idea of worth. And that is where the story becomes less about a single decade and more about the long argument over who gets to be visible, desirable, and fully human without first proving restraint. Fashion did not invent that argument, but in the 1990s it gave it one of its clearest and coldest faces. And to understand why that face still lingers, we have to look at the strange afterlife of nostalgia. How an aesthetic once criticized as dangerous can return years later not as warning, but as inspiration, mood board, and trend once again. And to understand why that face still lingers, we have to look at the strange afterlife of nostalgia. How an aesthetic once criticized as dangerous can return years later not as warning, but as inspiration, mood board, and trend once again. This is one of the most revealing habits of fashion. It forgets selectively. An era that once produced anxiety, criticism, and real physical harm can later be remembered through a softer lens, through silhouettes, colors, magazine covers, famous photographs, and the emotional shorthand of style. Time removes context first. What remains is often the image polished by distance. The 1990s became especially vulnerable to this kind of memory. Slip dresses returned. Low-rise silhouettes reappeared. Minimal makeup, pale skin, narrow sunglasses, angular tailoring, deliberately undone hair. All of it could be reintroduced as aesthetic reference, detached from the arguments that once surrounded it. People spoke about the 90s look with affection, irony, or admiration. Entire mood boards were built from fragments of the same visual world that had once been criticized for making fragility fashionable. This does not mean everyone forgot the darker history. Many did not, but nostalgia rarely works by direct denial. It works by editing, keeps the elegance. It removes the pressure. A black and white campaign becomes iconic rather than controversial. A famously thin celebrity becomes a symbol of effortless cool rather than the center of a debate about bodily expectation. The phrase heroin chic itself can be softened into a vague style reference, emptied of the original discomfort that made the phrase so disturbing. That softening matters because memory shapes repetition. If the past returns only as beauty, then its lessons return without their warnings. And fashion, perhaps more than most industries, depends on this kind of recycling. It survives by turning history into inventory, taking old anxiety, removing the guilt, and reselling it as freshness. This is why trends that look new are often emotionally very old. The return of 1990s aesthetics in later decades did not necessarily mean people wanted the full moral structure of heroin chic back. Most did not consciously want visible suffering as an ideal, but visual language has power even when detached from intention. A certain silhouette still carries associations. A certain body still reads as refined, controlled, desirable. Style can smuggle values more effectively than argument. Someone may simply say they like the clean lines, the minimalism, the mood, and perhaps they do. But the body required to make that mood feel complete often remains quietly present in the imagination. This is where nostalgia becomes historically important. It is not only about clothes returning. It is about which bodies are allowed to return with them. When a trend revival praises the slip dress but still imagines it primarily on one kind of frame, the old hierarchy survives beneath the new language. When the cool girl aesthetic is rebuilt around effortless thinness, emotional detachment, and studied indifference, the cultural memory of heroin chic has not vanished. It has simply become more polite, and politeness can be remarkably effective. Openly celebrating destructive thinness invites backlash. Quietly rewarding the same body through aesthetics of sophistication, wellness, or vintage cool is much easier. The image slips back into circulation without needing to defend itself. This is part of why younger generations often encounter these standards in fragmented ways. They may not know the original debates. They inherit the symbols without the arguments. A Pinterest board, an old editorial reposted online, a celebrity reference, a clean girl trend, a comment about looking like a 90s model. Each one carries traces of older beauty politics without announcing them. History arrives disguised as taste. That can make resistance difficult because it is harder to argue with atmosphere than with direct instruction. Nobody says you must look like this. They simply reward the people who do. This reward system is subtle but powerful. Social approval, fashion praise, the assumption of sophistication, The idea that some bodies naturally carry clothes better. These are not neutral observations. They are cultural judgments shaped by repetition. And repetition creates inevitability. People begin to speak as though the ideal body for a garment is an objective fact rather than a designed preference. Thinness becomes invisible as a standard precisely because it has been normalized for so long. It stops looking like one aesthetic among many and starts looking like the natural shape of elegance itself. That illusion is one of fashion's most enduring achievements. It transforms preference into common sense. This is why conversations about body diversity in fashion often meet resistance that sounds strangely practical rather than openly ideological. The clothes just hang better this way. It's about silhouette. It's about proportion. It's about the art. These explanations may contain technical truths, but they also protect inherited assumptions. They make a historical preference sound like neutral design logic. Once that happens, exclusion becomes easy to defend without ever being named as exclusion. The body is treated as the problem, not the standard. This logic extends beyond runways into everyday shopping. Entire generations have learned to assume that if clothing does not fit beautifully, the failure belongs to them. The garment becomes correct by default. The body becomes the site of correction. That emotional reflex is not trivial. It shapes confidence, spending, and the private architecture of self-worth. Someone standing in a dressing room, frustrated by a zipper or a waistline, is rarely only dealing with fabric. They are negotiating with years of cultural instruction about who fashion was designed to welcome. And often, that instruction is inherited from eras like the 1990s, when the ideal was made especially narrow and especially glamorous. Nostalgia makes this harder because it romanticizes the architecture while hiding the labor that held it up. People remember the coolness. They forget the constant calculation. They remember the photographs. They forget the routines behind them. They remember the model on the billboard. They forget the teenager learning to fear lunch. This selective memory is not unique to fashion. It happens in every cultural history. We romanticize decades by preserving their style and discarding their discomfort. But with beauty standards, the consequences are unusually intimate because they settle directly into the body. A nostalgic image does not remain external. It becomes a mirror. That is why the return of heroin chic aesthetics sparked such divided reactions in later years. Some saw only beautiful minimalism. Others saw a warning sign, a familiar visual language of disappearance returning under a more fashionable name. Both reactions were real, because beauty can be genuine and still be dangerous. That tension is difficult for people who love fashion, and it deserves honesty rather than simplification. Not every admirer of 1990s style is endorsing bodily harm. Clothing can be aesthetically meaningful without requiring total agreement with the system that produced it. Historical style is always complicated that way. But admiration becomes ethically different when it refuses context. To love the image while insisting the cost never mattered is not nostalgia. It is erasure, and erasure is often what makes repetition possible. This is why historians return to uncomfortable details, not to drain beauty from the past, but to keep beauty from becoming innocence. A style can be visually compelling and still built on damaging expectations. In fact, many of the most influential aesthetics in history are precisely those contradictions, beautiful surfaces covering difficult social truths. The heroin chic era belongs to that category. It was artistically powerful, commercially successful, and culturally influential. It also helped normalize a relationship to the body built around admiration for reduction. Both things can be true at once. Holding both truths is harder than choosing one, but it is closer to reality. And reality matters because the cycle is still active. Every few years, culture seems to rediscover the same temptation, to make self-erasure look elegant. Sometimes it appears through fashion photography, sometimes through celebrity discourse, sometimes through wellness language, sometimes through algorithmic trends that pretend to be personal expression while rewarding familiar forms of control. The names change. The reward structure often does not. This is why people sometimes feel as though history is repeating itself, even when the clothes are different. Because in a way, it is. The details shift, but the central bargain remains recognizable. Become smaller, become calmer, become easier to admire. And if that bargain feels familiar, it is because it has been offered for generations. The 1990s simply gave it a particularly memorable face. Perhaps that is why the era still provokes such fascination. It sits at the edge of glamour and accusation. People remember it as stylish and unsettling at the same time. It refuses easy nostalgia because too many people remember how it felt from the inside. That feeling matters more than the photographs. The quiet pride of fitting into something smaller. The panic of not. The compliment that lands like permission. The meal negotiated in silence. The sense that beauty and absence have somehow become the same thing. Those are not runway memories. They are ordinary life. And ordinary life is where cultural history becomes personal history. This is why the real question of Heroin Chic was never whether the photographs were beautiful enough to justify themselves. The deeper question was always what kind of person the culture was teaching people to become. Someone controlled, someone untouchable, someone who could convert need into elegance. That fantasy was powerful because it promised safety. If you could master the body completely, perhaps you could master judgment itself. Perhaps admiration would replace vulnerability. But beauty standards rarely deliver safety. They deliver maintenance. There is always another threshold, another correction, another smaller version of the self waiting ahead. That is the trap hidden inside the glamour. And by the time the nostalgia returned, many people had already lived long enough to recognize it. They could see the old pattern beneath the new styling. They knew that some aesthetics arrive wearing charm because history has made them photogenic. The question was whether the culture had learned enough to respond differently. Because remembering an era is one thing. Refusing to repeat its logic is something much harder. And as the conversation around beauty, wellness, and representation moved deeper into the 21st century, the next battle was no longer only about fashion images. It was about authority itself, who gets to define what health looks like, who profits from that definition, and why thinness remains so persuasive even after so many people claim to reject it. Because in the end, that may be the most honest way to understand the Heroin Chic era, not as a strange historical accident, but as one chapter in a much longer argument about authority, beauty, and the body. Who gets to decide what health looks like? Fashion tried to answer through images. Advertising answered through desire. Celebrity culture answered through imitation. Medicine sometimes answered through numbers. Families answered through habits. And individuals standing alone in front of mirrors were left trying to translate all of it into something livable. That is why the legacy of Heroin Chic reaches far beyond the 1990s. It was never only about pale skin, narrow hips, black and white campaigns, or the face of Kate Moss staring out from a magazine page. Those were symbols. The deeper issue was the repeated cultural lesson beneath them, that discipline is virtue, that visible appetite is suspect, and that beauty becomes more respectable when it looks like controlled absence. For a while, the industry made that lesson look glamorous. It photographed exhaustion as elegance, turned fragility into aspiration. It taught millions of people to see reduction not as warning, but as refinement. And because the images were beautiful, the lesson traveled further. That is what makes beauty standards so powerful. They do not persuade through argument. They persuade through atmosphere, through repetition, through the quiet feeling that this is simply what desirable looks like, what successful looks like, what being loved might require. Most people did not consciously choose that belief. They inherited it. They found it in compliments, in clothing sizes, in celebrity interviews, in the silence after dessert, in the casual praise of looking so small, in the fear of becoming visible in the wrong way. That inheritance is why looking back matters. Not to condemn one decade as uniquely foolish, but to understand how easily a culture can confuse harm with sophistication. Every era has its own version of that mistake. The 1990s happened to make theirs unusually visible. And perhaps that visibility was a strange kind of gift. Because when something becomes obvious enough, people can begin to question it. The backlash against heroin chic was imperfect, incomplete, and often absorbed back into the same system it criticized. But it still mattered. It proved that beauty standards are not natural law. They can be challenged. They can be named. They can lose some of their power once people stop mistaking them for truth. That does not mean the problem is solved. Thinness still carries prestige in ways that are often denied and deeply understood at the same time. Wellness can still become moral theater. Social media can still turn insecurity into a business model. Fashion can still rename the same old demand and sell it as progress. But awareness creates friction, and friction matters. It means fewer people accept the standard without question. It means more people recognize manipulation when they see it. It means a young person looking at an old campaign might feel not only admiration, but skepticism. That skepticism is a form of freedom. Because once you understand that beauty standards are designed, you can begin to ask who benefits from them. Once you see that elegance has often been built on exclusion, you can decide whether admiration is worth imitation. Once you realize that taking up less space has been repeatedly sold as virtue, you can ask a better question. What would beauty look like if it were not organized around disappearance? That question is larger than fashion. It touches work, love, aging, gender, class, and the strange modern habit of treating the body like a moral resume. It asks whether worth can exist without constant proof. Whether health can be separated from performance. Whether pleasure can exist without apology. History does not answer those questions for us, but it does offer perspective. It reminds us that standards change, that certainty ages badly, that what one decade calls ideal, another may see as cruelty dressed well. The heroin chic era is remembered because it captured that truth with unusual clarity. It showed how quickly glamour can become discipline, and how difficult it is to tell the difference when the lighting is good enough. It also left behind a warning. Whenever a culture begins praising people most for how little they seem to need, less food, less rest, less softness, less visible desire, it is worth paying attention. The language may sound modern, the styling may look fresh, but the logic is often very old. And old systems survive by convincing each generation that they are new. So perhaps the real history of heroin chic is not about a trend ending. It is about learning to recognize a pattern before it changes its name again. The body was never just the body. It was a stage for ambition, a map of class, a site of discipline, a negotiation with approval, a place where private feeling met public expectation. Fashion simply made that negotiation visible, sometimes beautifully, sometimes cruelly, often both at once. And if there is something worth carrying forward from this story, it may be this: beauty becomes dangerous when it asks for erasure as the price of belonging. The most radical correction is not a new trend. It is the refusal to treat shrinking as proof of worth. That refusal is quiet. It happens in ordinary rooms, at dinner tables, in fitting rooms, in the language people use with themselves when no one else is listening. history lives there too. And maybe that is where real change begins, not on the runway, but in the moment someone decides they no longer want admiration built on absence. If this part of history surprised you, I'd love to know what detail stayed with you most, or what beauty standard from another era you think people today still misunderstand. And if you enjoy these calm, deep dives into the stranger corners of history, subscribe and come back for the next one. For now, it is enough to remember that behind every iconic image is a quieter human story, and sometimes the most important history is hidden in what a culture once taught people to call beautiful.